The sterile scent of bleach and ammonia clung to Alara Vance's clothes like a second skin, a constant reminder of the life she hadn't chosen. At 22, her world had shrunk to the vast, silent expanse of the executive floors of Thorn Industries. Each night she moved like a ghost through the glass and steel canyons of power, her reflection a fleeting smudge on the polished marble floors. The squeak of her cleaning cart was the only sound that acknowledged her existence in the hollow cathedral of commerce, a space built for men whose names were etched on brass plaques, while hers was destined to be forgotten by morning. Her hands, chapped and raw, worked with a mechanical efficiency that belied the storm of thoughts raging within her, a mind filled with the colors and textures of a world she could only dream of touching. If you want to know what happens when an invisible girl is finally seen by the one man who should never have noticed her, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you are watching from. We continue. Her true life began long after the last drop of polish had dried, in the quiet solitude of her small apartment. There, under the dim glow of a bedside lamp, she would lose herself in the hallowed pages of art restoration textbooks. Her fingers, which spent their days wiping away the grime of the city, would gently trace the lines of a Rembrandt portrait, or the delicate brushstrokes of a Vermeer. She had been an aspiring art historian, her future a bright canvas, before her mother's illness had painted it over with shades of gray, forcing her to trade university halls for sterile corporate corridors. This secret study was more than a hobby. It was an act of defiance, a way of keeping a small, vibrant piece of her soul alive in the suffocating grip of duty and circumstance. Her virginity was not a statement of piety or a choice she proudly proclaimed. It was a fortress built around a fragile heart. She had learned early, through the careless hands and dismissive words of a boy who saw her as a conquest rather than a person, that intimacy could be a form of erasure. He had tried to mold her, to smooth over her quiet complexities, until she fit his narrow expectations, and in the process, she had nearly lost herself. So she had built walls, not of stone, but of silence and observation. She watched the world of touch and connection from a safe distance. A student of an art, she was too afraid to practice. Her body remained an undiscovered country, its borders secured by the quiet, persistent fear of being unseen even in the most intimate of embraces. The architecture of Thorn Industries was a constant, cruel metaphor for her existence. The floor-to-ceiling windows on the 50th floor offered a god's-eye view of Chicago, a sprawling tapestry of light and life that she was fundamentally separate from. During the day, she was invisible to the powerful executives who strode past her, their conversations about mergers and acquisitions a foreign language. At night, she polished away their fingerprints, erasing the last physical evidence of their dominance, only to have them return the next day to leave their mark again. She was a custodian of a world that would never claim her, a silent witness to a game in which she was not even a pawn but merely a part of the board itself, unnoticed and taken for granted. The journey home was a descent, both literally and figuratively. From the gleaming heights of the financial district, the train carried her back to the gritty reality of her neighborhood, where the buildings were made of brick and weariness, not glass and ambition. Her apartment was small, the air thick with the scent of herbal remedies and the unspoken weight of medical bills piled high on the kitchen counter. Yet, it was here, in this cramped space, that she found her only true expansion. The art books were her escape, portals to Renaissance Florence or 17th century Amsterdam. In their pages, she wasn't the cleaning girl. She was a scholar, a connoisseur, a woman with a voice and a perspective that mattered, even if the only one who heard it was herself. The silence of the apartment was often broken by the shallow, rattling cough from her mother's bedroom. It was a sound that both broke her heart and fortified her resolve. Every drop of bleach she used, every floor she scrubbed, was an offering at the altar of her mother's well-being. This sense of duty was her anchor, the thing that kept her from drifting away on a sea of resentment and what-ifs. But it was also her cage, a gilded prison of love and responsibility that kept her wings clipped. She felt the constant, grinding tension between the daughter she needed to be and the woman she yearned to become, a conflict that played out in the quiet, lonely hours before dawn, leaving her perpetually exhausted and emotionally raw. Standing before her small bedroom window, Alara would gaze out at the distant city skyline. The Thorn Industries tower stood apart from the others, a shard of obsidian stabbing at the night sky, impossibly tall and remote. It was a monument to a kind of power and freedom she couldn't comprehend. A world where dreams weren't just hoarded in secret, but were built into reality. A profound ache would settle deep in her chest, a hollow feeling of emptiness that whispered of a life unlived. She felt like a carefully preserved painting stored in a dark, forgotten basement, waiting for someone, anyone, to bring her into the light, unaware that the one man who held the key to that room was the very architect of the tower that symbolized her gilded cage. The city of Chicago awoke with a groan, a symphony of distant sirens, and the rumble of the first L train. For Ilara, the day began not with the sun, but with the shrill, insistent beep of a cheap alarm clock that sat on her nightstand next to a well-worn copy of The Theory of Restoration. The sound was a cleaver, severing the gossamer threads of her dreams of ochre pigments and sun-drenched Italian studios, and yanking her back into the gray reality of her life. She would lie still for a moment, the weight of the coming hours pressing down on her like a physical blanket. Her small room, with its peeling paint and a window that overlooked a brick wall, was a constant, suffocating reminder of the world she inhabited, a world where beauty was a luxury she could only afford in books. Her mother, Martha, was the quiet, fragile center of this world. Her room smelled of lavender oil and antiseptic wipes, a cloying combination of comfort and decay. Martha's love was a powerful, binding force, woven with threads of guilt and obligation. She never raised her voice, never made demands, but her soft, disappointed sighs held more power than any command. "You're a good daughter, Ilara," she would whisper, her hand, thin as a bird's claw, clutching Ilara's. The words were meant as a blessing, but they felt like a sentence, chaining Ilara to this life of sacrifice. Each morning, Ilara would prepare her mother's tea and medication with a tenderness that masked a deep, roiling resentment she was too ashamed to acknowledge, a feeling of being slowly consumed by the very person she was trying to save. The financial pressure was a constant, low-grade fever. A stack of envelopes on the kitchen table served as a monument to their quiet desperation, their crisp white edges a stark contrast to the worn laminate surface. Each windowed pane revealed another bolded, unforgiving number from a hospital, a pharmacy, a specialist. Ilara would stare at them while her coffee grew cold, the figures swimming before her eyes. They weren't just bills. They were a tally of her lost opportunities, a quantifiable measure of her trapped existence. She traced the logo of a collections agency with her finger, feeling the cold dread seep into her bones. This debt was the true architect of her prison, its walls built of interest rates and final notices, ensuring that any thought of escape, of returning to her studies, was nothing more than a cruel fantasy. Her daily commute was a journey through varying shades of hopelessness. The neighborhood was a grid of tired brick buildings and cracked sidewalks, where the dreams of its residents seemed to have seeped into the very mortar, leaving it gray and brittle. On the train, she was surrounded by faces etched with a similar weariness, people on their way to jobs they endured, not loved. She would press her forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the landscape shift from gritty residential blocks to the gleaming, arrogant towers of the Loop. The transition was jarring, a daily reminder of the vast, unbridgeable chasm between her world and the one she serviced. She felt like a trespasser, a ghost moving between two realities, belonging to neither, her invisibility, her only passport. The community she lived in was tightly knit, bound by shared struggles and a conservative, traditional ethos. Here, a woman's value was measured by her utility, as a daughter, a wife, a mother. Mrs. Gable from next door would often catch her on the stairs, her eyes filled with a pity that felt like judgment. "Such a good girl, taking care of your mother," she'd say, before inevitably adding, "You should find a nice, steady man to help you with the burden. It's not right for a young woman to be alone." This narrative was relentlessly pushed upon her, the idea that her only salvation lay in surrendering her independence to a man. It reinforced the notion that her own ambitions were selfish, frivolous flights of fancy in a world that demanded practical, sacrificial women. Martha, in her weaker moments, would echo these sentiments, her voice laced with a lifetime of her own deferred dreams. She'd speak of the handsome factory foreman she could have married, the stable life she'd given up for Ilara's father, a charming artist who left them with nothing but memories and debt. "Passion is a dangerous thing, my love," she'd murmur, her gaze distant. It burns bright and then leaves you in the cold. Find a man who is safe, a man who will provide. She was trying to protect Ilara from the same heartbreak she had suffered, but in doing so, she was unknowingly crafting a cage for her daughter. One padded with good intentions but locked tight with fear, preparing her for a life devoid of the very color and passion Ilara secretly craved. Yet, even in this monochrome existence, Ilara's spirit fought for light. She found slivers of beauty in the overlooked corners of her world. A patch of resilient wildflowers pushing through a crack in the pavement, the intricate pattern of rust on a fire escape, the way the late afternoon sun would occasionally strike a window and scatter a prism of rainbows across her drab apartment wall. These moments were her secret sustenance. She would commit them to memory, analyzing their composition, their texture, their emotional resonance, as if they were masterpieces in a gallery. It was a silent act of defiance, a declaration that even if her body was trapped in a life of drudgery, her mind, her artist's eye, remained fiercely, stubbornly free. The weight of being the good daughter was immense. It was a role she played to perfection, but one that was slowly eroding her sense of self. At family gatherings or community events, she felt the collective gaze of her relatives and neighbors upon her. They saw her quiet demeanor, her tireless devotion to her mother, and they approved. Their praise was a heavy cloak, suffocating her. They saw the facade, the dutiful girl, but they were blind to the vibrant, complex woman underneath. This constant performance was exhausting, forcing her to bury her own desires, her opinions, her very essence, so deep that she sometimes feared she would forget they were ever there, leaving only the hollow shell of the person everyone expected her to be. This relentless emotional and psychological strain manifested physically. A permanent knot of tension resided between her shoulder blades. She often caught her reflection and was startled by the dark circles under her eyes, the drawn, pale quality of her skin. She moved with a quiet efficiency that bordered on self-effacement, her shoulders slightly hunched as if to make herself smaller, to take up less space. Her body had become a vessel for her obligations, a machine programmed for cleaning, lifting, and caring. The life force within her, the vibrant energy of a 22-year-old woman, was being systematically drained, redirected into maintaining her mother's fragile health and paying off an insurmountable debt, leaving little for self. Each night, the cycle would complete itself. Back in her room, the world of Thorn Industries and her oppressive reality would recede, replaced by the hushed reverence of her art books. She would run her fingers over a photograph of a painting by Artemisia Gentileschi, a woman who had channeled her pain into powerful, defiant art. Through the open door she could see the menacing stack of bills on the kitchen table, a stark white tombstone marking the grave of her ambitions, the chasm between the life she dreamed of, one of beauty, intellect, and purpose, and the life she was living felt infinite. She was trapped between two irreconcilable worlds, a prisoner of circumstance, unaware that the key to her cage was held by a man who was just as imprisoned by his own past. He was less a man and more a force of nature, a shift in the atmospheric pressure whenever he swept through the corridors. Ilara Vance knew of Julian Thorne the way one knows of a distant dangerous storm on the horizon. She had seen him only in glimpses. The sharp, unforgiving line of his jaw and profile, the glint of a ferociously expensive watch on his wrist as he gestured impatiently during a phone call, the impeccable cut of his charcoal suits that seemed to absorb the light around him. He moved with a chilling economy of motion, his presence sucking the warmth from any room he entered. To her, he was the architect of this glass and steel world, a remote deity who had never cast his gaze low enough to notice the mortals who polished his floors. His indifference was a form of power, rendering her utterly and completely invisible. The whispers that followed him were a currency among the staff. In the hushed break rooms and sterile hallways, they called him the Ice King, a man who had dismantled his father's legacy and rebuilt it into a colder, more ruthless empire. Stories circulated of hostile takeovers, orchestrated with surgical precision, of entire departments erased overnight with a single, dispassionate email. They said he had no friends, only assets, no heart, only a calculator where it should be. These tales, whether true or exaggerated, painted a portrait of a man utterly detached from the human cost of his ambition. For Ilara, these fragments of information solidified his image as something untouchable, A predator at the apex of a food chain she wasn't even a part of. He wasn't just her employer. He was a symbol of the crushing impersonal power that governed her world. From the silent vantage point of the 52nd floor, the city sprawled below Julian Thorne's office like a circuit board of captured lightning, a kingdom he commanded but did not inhabit. He often stood there late into the night, the reflection of his tailored suit, a ghostly imposition on the view. The silence in his glass fortress was absolute, a perfect vacuum where the accolades and triumphs of the day went to die. He had built an empire of noise and aggression, yet he existed in a profound, self-imposed isolation. This solitude was his armor, forged in the fires of a past he had systematically tried to incinerate. It was a past that smelled of oil paints and Dutch tulips, a past that whispered to him in a language he refused to speak, a past whose vulnerability he equated with a fatal, unforgivable weakness. One Tuesday night the city outside was weeping. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows of the executive floor, blurring the skyline into a watercolor of bleeding neon. The sound of the storm was a low, mournful drumbeat accompanying the squeak of Alara's cleaning cart. She worked with her head down, a practiced habit of self-effacement, her movements quiet and methodical. The only light on the entire floor spilled from Julian Thorne's partially open office door, a blade of sterile white cutting through the gloom. A palpable tension emanated from it, the low, guttural murmur of his voice laced with a fury that made the air feel thin and electric. She tried to hurry past, to remain a shadow on the periphery of his anger, but fate had other plans. The murmur escalated into a sharp, clipped curse, followed by a sound that made Alara flinch, the distinct clatter of a smartphone hitting the marble floor with violent force. The device skidded out from his doorway and came to a rest just inches from the wheel of her cart, its screen still glowing. A heavy, ringing silence descended, thick with unspoken rage. Alara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every instinct, every rule she lived by, screamed at her to keep moving, to pretend she hadn't seen or heard anything. To acknowledge the fallen object was to acknowledge the man, and to do that was to risk his notice, a terrifying prospect. But her body, acting on an impulse of simple human decency, betrayed her. Before she could stop herself, she knelt, her worn sneakers silent on the polished stone. Her fingers, chapped from chemicals, closed around the cool, sleek device. Just as she touched it, a voice, tinny and frantic, erupted from the speaker. It wasn't English. It was a torrent of panicked Dutch, the words tumbling over one another in a desperate plea. The language struck Alara with the force of a memory. It was the language of her grandmother's lullabies, the language of the letters she had helped translate for an art history professor, the language of Rembrandt and Vermeer. It was a piece of her secret scholarly life, a key to a world far removed from this sterile corporate tower, suddenly and impossibly present in the palm of her hand. A strange calm settled over her, overriding the fear. The academic in her, the part of her that was still an art historian, took over. Without looking toward the darkened doorway, she brought the phone closer and spoke into it. Her Dutch was flawless, her tone measured and soothing, a stark contrast to the panicked voice on the other end. She calmly translated the man's frantic message, something about a delayed shipment and a customs issue in Rotterdam, relaying the core information with a precision that was second nature to her. In that moment, she was not Alara the cleaner, a ghost in the machine. She was a scholar, a communicator, a person of quiet competence, and she had forgotten to be invisible. He appeared in the doorway then, a silhouette against the harsh light of his office. Julian Thorne stood perfectly still, his face a mask of cold astonishment. The fury that had radiated from him moments before had vanished, replaced by a raw, unguarded shock that seemed to crack his icy composure. He stared at her, not at the phone in her hand, but directly at her face, as if he were seeing her for the very first time. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, were fixed on her with a piercing intensity that stripped her bare. It wasn't the dismissive glance of a superior. It was the look of a man who had just witnessed a ghost step out of the walls and speak in the forgotten tongue of his deepest wound. A wave of icy dread washed over Alara as the reality of her transgression crashed down. She had spoken. She had been seen. She rose slowly, her joints stiff, and held the phone out to him. Her hand trembled, a small, betraying motion in the charged silence. He didn't move to take it immediately, his gaze still locked on hers, searching, questioning, dissecting her, as if she were an impossible artifact. The air between them was thick with unspoken history, with the sudden, violent collision of two disparate worlds. Finally, his fingers brushed against hers as he took the phone, an accidental contact that sent a jolt of pure electricity through her, hot and terrifying. The brief touch felt more intimate than any she had ever known. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, not of thanks but of acknowledgement. Then he turned and retreated into his office, the door clicking shut behind him with a soft final sound that echoed in the cavernous hall. Elara was left standing in the dim light, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The spot where his fingers had touched hers burned. She was no longer just a part of the building's function. She was a question he now needed to answer. And for Julian, alone in his office, the ghost of his mother's voice had been awakened, and the obsessive, dangerous curiosity now taking root in his soul felt perilously close to the very vulnerability he had spent his entire life trying to destroy. The night of the incident bled into a week of suffocating silence. Elara moved through her duties on the executive floor with a heightened, painful awareness, every nerve ending frayed. She expected to be fired at any moment, to be called into a sterile HR office and dismissed for her transgression. The absence of any response from Julian Thorne was more terrifying than his anger would have been. It was a cold, calculated void that left her in a state of perpetual suspense. She would polish the surface of his desk, her own reflection staring back, distorted and pale, and feel the ghost of his gaze upon her. The memory of his fingers brushing against hers had left a permanent brand on her skin, a phantom heat that served as a constant reminder of the invisible line she had so recklessly crossed, stepping out of the shadows and into his line of sight. Her dread peaked each evening as the elevator ascended toward his domain. She braced herself for a confrontation, for the finality of dismissal, but nothing happened. The routine remained unbroken, yet the atmosphere had irrevocably shifted. The silence on the 52nd floor was no longer empty. It was charged, watchful. Elara felt as though the glass walls themselves had developed eyes, scrutinizing her every move. She could feel his presence even when he wasn't there, a lingering intensity in the air of his office. The scent of expensive cologne mixed with something metallic and cold, like unsheathed steel. This new dynamic was a form of psychological warfare, a silent assertion of his power. He had chosen not to erase her but to observe her, and this focused attention was a far more intimate and unsettling violation than his previous indifference had ever been. Then, the first test. One evening, placed with surgical precision on the corner of his vast, empty desk, was a heavy, leather-bound book. It was a monograph on the Dutch master Johannes Vermeer. The book was open to a 2-page spread featuring a high-resolution image of the concert, a painting that had been famously stolen from a Boston museum decades ago and was still missing. Its placement was an act of deliberate provocation, a lure cast into the silent waters of their new awareness. It was a question posed without words, a test of her knowledge, her curiosity, and her discipline. He was baiting the art historian he now knew existed beneath the drab, functional uniform of the cleaning girl, silently asking, "Are you who I think you are?" A war raged within her, every instinct for self-preservation, honed by years of making herself small and invisible, screamed at her to ignore the book. To touch his personal property was a cardinal sin, a direct violation of her employment terms. But the art historian, the woman she kept locked away in the late hours of the night, was powerfully drawn to the page. The deep, luminous colors, the masterful play of light on fabric and skin. It was a language she understood better than any other. She could feel his challenge hanging in the air. A silent dare. It was an invitation into a conversation she was forbidden to have, and the temptation to respond, to prove herself, was a physical ache in her chest, a desperate yearning to be truly seen. Her resolve fractured. After a long, agonizing moment, her gaze darting toward the darkened doorway of his office, she succumbed. She did not touch the book, but she leaned in close, her breath misting slightly on the glossy page. Her eyes devoured the details, the subtle tension in the musician's posture, the rich texture of the Turkish carpet, the the way the light from the window seemed to hold a story of its own. Without conscious thought, a whisper escaped her lips, a single, academic observation about the likely source of the artist's notoriously expensive lapis lazuli pigment. "Mind in Afghanistan," she murmured to the silent room, the sound of her own voice, so full of forgotten confidence, shocking her back into a state of panicked awareness. She quickly retreated, her heart hammering against her ribs. He began to alter his routine, a subtle shift that was entirely for her benefit. He started staying late, not closeted in his office, but standing in the open-plan areas, a solitary figure framed against the glittering expanse of the city skyline. He never spoke to her or even directly looked at her as she worked her way around him, but his presence was a magnetic force, warping the space between them. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, a silent, intense scrutiny that tracked her movements as she polished floors and emptied wastebaskets. She felt like a rare butterfly pinned under glass, her quiet dignity and practiced invisibility now, the very things that seemed to fascinate him. The power dynamic had been inverted. She was no longer unseen. She was the singular focus of the king in his castle. A week passed in this state of charged silence before the next test appeared. The Vermeer book was gone. In its place was another, this one detailing the complex and controversial restoration of Rembrandt's The Night Watch. Tucked neatly beside it was a small, cream-colored card, the kind used for personal correspondence. On it, written in a sharp, elegant script that was as severe and controlled as the man himself, was a single question. Was the 1975 restoration too aggressive in its use of solvents? It was no longer a silent invitation. It was a direct summons. He was demanding she engage, that she step across the chasm of their social and professional stations and meet him on his intellectual ground. The question was a key, offered to a door she had long believed was permanently locked. Ilara's hands trembled as she cleaned around the desk, her gaze repeatedly snagged by the stark black ink on the cream card. To answer was an act of profound insubordination, a confirmation that she was not just the cleaner, but an active participant in his strange, silent game. It would be a surrender of her only defense, her anonymity. Yet the question itself was a siren's call. It was a question for a scholar, a peer. It acknowledged her expertise, her mind, a part of her that had been starved for recognition for so long. The desire to answer, to articulate her carefully formed opinions, to feel the thrill of intellectual debate again, was a powerful, intoxicating force, warring against years of conditioned fear and the quiet, persistent voice that warned her this was a dangerous path. She found a compromise, a move of quiet defiance. She would not write a reply, not leave her own handwriting as evidence of her complicity. Instead, later in her shift, she retrieved a different restoration manual from the firm's small, underused library. She found a chapter analyzing less invasive cleaning techniques used on other Dutch Golden Age paintings and placed a small, discreetly folded piece of paper to mark the relevant page. She then left the book on a credenza near his desk, not on it, but within his line of sight. It was a subtle countermove in their silent game of chess, an answer that was also a question. A way of engaging without fully surrendering, a demonstration of her knowledge on her own terms. The following evening, both the book and her makeshift bookmark were gone. In their place, on the exact spot where the question had been, stood a single perfect tulip in a slender crystal vase. It was a deep, velvety crimson, its petals still tightly closed, a bud of immense potential. The gesture struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow. It was so deeply personal, so startlingly intimate. A tulip, the enduring symbol of the Netherlands, of his mother's heritage, of the very language that had first connected them. This was no longer an intellectual exercise. He was no longer just testing her mind. He was offering a piece of his own fractured history, a symbol of the vulnerability he kept so fiercely guarded. The flower was a confession, and it terrified her more than any command. This silent, escalating courtship began to dismantle the fortress she had built around her heart. The raw fear she had initially felt was slowly being transmuted into a confusing, powerful, and deeply unsettling attraction. She found herself thinking of him constantly, her days consumed by a restless anticipation for the night. She would analyze his gestures, the subtle shifts in his posture, The unspoken meaning behind each book, each question, each silence. The carefully constructed walls of her emotional virginity, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now seemed like a prison. His attention was a dangerous, brilliant light, and she, a creature accustomed to the shadows, found herself turning toward its warmth, with a terrifying instinctual pull that threatened to burn her. From the darkened observation deck of his office, Julian watched her. This had begun as a clinical exercise, an attempt to understand an anomaly, a ghost who spoke his mother's language. But it had spiraled beyond his control. Her quiet intelligence, her stubborn refusal to be intimidated, the profound sadness he saw in her eyes, it all resonated with the ghost of his mother. He saw in Ilara the same fierce passion for beauty that had been his mother's greatest gift, and, ultimately, her fatal flaw. A dangerous, possessive need was growing within him. He wanted to unlock the secrets she kept hidden, but he was terrified that in touching her soul, he would inevitably break her, just as his father had broken the woman whose memory she so painfully and beautifully evoked. The tension could no longer be contained by silence and symbols. As her shift ended one rainy Thursday, she found him waiting for her by the main elevator bank, his back to her as he stared at his reflection in the polished brass doors. He didn't turn when he heard her approach. "My office," he said, his voice a low, rough command that cut through the sterile quiet. "Tomorrow, 9 a.m." The words were clipped, devoid of emotion, yet they carried the weight of an ultimatum. He was ending their silent game and summoning her into his world, into the full light of day. For Ilara, the implications were seismic. This was the precipice. There would be no going back to the safety of being invisible. The ghost was being called to account. Sleep offered no escape that night. His words echoed in the cramped silence of her apartment, a relentless loop of command and possibility. What could he possibly want? A formal reprimand followed by her termination? An offer of a different, less visible position in the company's archives? Or was it something else entirely, something more personal and far more dangerous? She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind a maelstrom of fear and a fragile, fluttering hope she was ashamed to admit to. She looked at the ominous stack of medical bills on her nightstand, a monument to her trapped existence. The life she knew was a slow, predictable suffocation. The life he represented was a terrifying, brilliant unknown, a leap into a void from which she might never return. Her dilemma became a moral crisis. To go to his office, dressed in her uniform, would be to accept his power, to play the role of the subordinate he had summoned. A cold wave of fear washed over her as she remembered the casual cruelty of the boy from her past, who had tried to mold her into his own image. Was Julian Thorne just a more sophisticated version of the same threat, a man who saw her not as a person, but as an interesting puzzle to be solved and then discarded? Yet the alternative, to refuse, to retreat back into the gray, anonymous rhythm of her life, now felt like an unbearable surrender. He had awakened her desire to be seen, to be heard, to be more, and that desire, once roused, refused to be silenced again. She rose before dawn and stood before her small bookshelf, her fingers tracing the spines of her art history texts. They were her only real treasures, the evidence of the woman she was supposed to be. Her hand stopped on a biography of Artemisia Gentileschi, the Baroque painter who had transformed her personal trauma into powerful, defiant masterpieces. In that moment, the choice crystallized. Safety was no longer a sanctuary, it was a cage. Her emotional and physical distance had been a shield against the pain of being overlooked. But Julian Thorne saw her. That was the fundamental, terrifying truth. The risk of being shattered by someone who truly saw her was immense, but the possibility of being truly known was a siren's call she no longer had the will to resist. As the first light of dawn painted the Chicago skyline in bruised shades of purple and gold, Ilara made her decision. She would not go to him as Ilara Vance, the cleaning lady. She opened her closet and pulled out a simple, dark blue sheath dress, a relic from a scholarship interview years ago, from a life she thought was gone forever. As she slipped it on, the fabric cool against her skin, she felt a profound shift within herself. This was not just a dress. It was armor. She was clothing herself in the identity he had unearthed. the scholar and art historian who had been waiting in the shadows. She was consciously choosing the terrifying allure of desire over the hollow promise of safety, stepping out of her own life and into his. The elevator doors slid open onto the executive floor, and a hush fell over the morning's usual hum of activity. Elara Vance stepped out, not in the invisible gray uniform of the night shift, but in a simple, dark blue sheath dress that clung to her form with a quiet defiance. She felt the collective gaze of assistants and junior executives lock onto her, their faces a mixture of confusion and disdain. She was an anomaly, a disruption to the established order. Each step she took on the polished marble floor, her sensible heels clicking with a resolve she did not feel, was an act of transgression. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage of her own making. She was walking willingly into the lion's den, armed with nothing but the fragile hope that he might see her as more than his prey. She pushed open the heavy oak door to his office without knocking. Julian Thorne sat behind his immense desk, a fortress of glass and steel, his attention fixed on a document. He didn't look up immediately, his voice a low, dismissive rumble. "Leave it on the credenza." When she didn't move, he finally raised his eyes, and for a breathtaking second, his mask of cold control shattered. He saw the dress, the determined set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes, and he was momentarily silenced. She was not the cleaning girl he had summoned. Before he could recover, she spoke, her voice steadier than she ever imagined it could be. "I need to know," she said, the words a clear, sharp note in the silent room. "When you look at me, do you see a person, or just a puzzle piece from your past?" The directness of her challenge was a physical blow. No one spoke to Julian Thorne this way. He rose slowly from his chair, the movement fluid and predatory, and began to circle the desk, closing the space between them. His height, his sheer presence, was meant to intimidate, to reassert the power dynamic she had just dared to dismantle. But Elara held her ground, her gaze unwavering. He stopped just a foot from her, close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his stormy eyes, the faint tension in his jaw. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. He was looking at her, truly looking, and what he saw was not just an echo of his mother, but a woman of formidable, quiet strength. In that moment, he abandoned his plan. Without a word, he turned and gestured toward a wall panel, a silent command that felt more like a surrender. The panel slid open to reveal a private elevator she had never known existed. He led her inside, the doors closing with a soft, metallic sigh that sealed them off from the world. The elevator didn't ascend. It descended, a symbolic journey into the foundations of the tower and into the depths of his own buried history. The air grew cooler, the silence more absolute, broken only by the low hum of the machinery. When the doors opened again, they were in a stark, climate-controlled corridor that felt more like a laboratory than a part of an office building. He stopped before a heavy, featureless steel door and entered a code. The intricate series of clicks and whirs from the locking mechanism was deafening, the sound of a tomb being unsealed. A shiver of apprehension and profound curiosity traced its way down Elara's spine as he pushed the heavy door inward. The space beyond was not a storage room but a sanctuary, a perfectly preserved private gallery. The walls were lined with masterpieces of the Dutch Golden Age, their gilded frames glowing softly under precisely aimed lights. The air smelled of old canvas, linseed oil, and the faint, sweet scent of decay that clings to history. Elara felt the breath leave her body in a silent gasp. It was a room filled with staggering beauty and an almost unbearable sorrow. This was his mother's collection, her passion, her soul, and he had kept it here, locked away from the world. A shrine he both revered and resented. It was not a gallery. It was the physical manifestation of his heart, a place of profound love and even more profound pain, and he had just granted her entry into its most sacred wounded chamber. Julian stood in the center of the room, dwarfed by the towering canvases, his power and authority stripped away by the ghosts that inhabited the space. His voice, when he finally spoke, was raw and unfamiliar, laced with a grief that was decades old. "My father saw these as investments," he began, his gaze fixed on a portrait of a woman with sad, intelligent eyes, his mother. She saw them as conversations with the dead. He called her passion a weakness, a vulnerability he could exploit. And he did. He confessed the whole tragic story, his father's emotional cruelty, his mother's slow decline, how she had retreated into her world of art until it was the only thing left of her. "I hated this room," he whispered, turning to Ilara. "I hated it because it was all that was left of her weakness, a weakness I now see in you." Ilara listened, her own history of being unseen and undervalued resonating with the story of the woman on the wall. She saw past the ruthless tycoon to the wounded boy who had locked his heart away with his mother's paintings, equating love with inevitable pain. She didn't offer empty platitudes or pity. Instead, she walked to a small, luminous Vermeer, a painting of a woman reading a letter by a window. "She isn't weak," Ilara said softly, her voice filling the reverent silence. "Look at the light. The artist didn't use it to hide her flaws. He used it to reveal her truth, her inner world. That's not weakness. It's the ultimate form of strength." She was no longer talking about the painting. She was talking about him, seeing him with a clarity that stripped him of his defenses. He turned from the painting to face her, his eyes dark with a maelstrom of anguish and a raw, undeniable need that mirrored her own. The space between them, once a vast chasm of class and power, had shrunk to a single charged breath. The air was thick with the scent of old paint and the combined weight of their loneliness. He reached out, his hand trembling almost imperceptibly as his fingers brushed the line of her jaw. It was a question, a plea, an offer of his own brokenness. In answer, Ilara closed her eyes and leaned into his touch, a silent, complete surrender of the fortress she had guarded for so long. He closed the final distance, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of desperate, soul-deep recognition, a homecoming she never knew she was searching for. The kiss shattered them both. It deepened into a raw, desperate torrent of every suppressed emotion, every lonely night, every deferred dream. It tasted of salt from tears she hadn't realized she'd shed, of his sorrow, and of a burning, impossible hope. His hands moved from her face to the small of her back, pulling her flush against the hard lines of his body, not as an act of possession, but as if to anchor himself to her reality. The walls Ilara had so carefully built around her heart were not merely breached. They were obliterated. For the first time, a man's touch did not erase her but brought her into brilliant, breathtaking focus. She clung to him, her fingers tangling in the silk of his hair, answering his silent, starving hunger with the full force of her own. They finally broke apart. Breathless and trembling, their foreheads resting against each other, they were no longer the CEO and the cleaner, the king and the ghost. They were just Julian and Ilara, two people stripped bare in a vault of memory. His eyes were closed, his jaw tight, and as she watched, a single tear escaped and traced a path down his temple. That silent tear was a more profound confession than any words he could have spoken. He had not just given her a kiss, he had given her access to the most broken, guarded part of his soul. For Ilara, this was the point of no return. Her first kiss, her first true act of intimate surrender, was given. She had chosen the terrifying, brilliant light of desire, and in doing so had irrevocably bound her fate to this beautiful, damaged man. The elevator ascended in a silence that was heavier and more fragile than any that had come before. The kiss had been a cataclysm, shattering the world they had known, and leaving them adrift in the wreckage. Ilara could feel the heat of a blush staining her neck, her entire body thrumming with a terrifying, new awareness. She dared a glance at Julian, but the man beside her was a stranger. The raw vulnerability she had witnessed in the vault was gone, replaced by a chilling, impenetrable remoteness. His jaw was set like granite, his gaze fixed on the ascending floor numbers, as if they were the only thing holding his world together. He had retreated so completely into himself that she felt the cold radiating from him, a physical manifestation of his regret. The intimacy they had shared was already being encased in ice, and the speed of his withdrawal was a silent, brutal rejection. When the doors slid open onto the executive floor, he didn't look at her. He simply walked out, his steps measured and precise, and waited for her to follow. The brief, fragile connection that had existed between them in the vault was severed. He was once again the CEO, and she was the subordinate. "My assistant will contact you on Monday with the details of your new position," he stated, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "Your previous employment is terminated, effective immediately." The words were like stones, each one a blow that knocked the air from her lungs. He had reduced the profound soul-bearing moment they had just shared to a mere business transaction, a prerequisite for a promotion. He turned and walked toward his office without a backward glance, leaving her standing alone by the elevator, feeling as though he had not just kissed her, but had stolen something vital and then dismissed her like a common thief. The journey home was a blur, a descent through the layers of a city that seemed both alien and achingly familiar. Ilara sat on the train, her reflection a ghostly image in the darkened window, and unconsciously touched her lips. They still tingled, a phantom echo of his desperate kiss. A confusing, violent storm of emotions raged within her. The deep, searing shame of her own surrender, mixed with a strange, nascent sense of power. She had been seen. For one breathtaking moment in that vault, she had been more real to him than anyone. She had cracked his armor and witnessed the wounded heart he kept so fiercely guarded. While he had immediately rebuilt his walls, higher and colder than before, the knowledge that she had been inside was an undeniable truth. She was no longer just a spectator to his life. She was now the keeper of his most sacred wound, a secret that bound them together even as he tried to tear them apart. Stepping into her apartment was like stepping back into a monochrome world after a brief, violent explosion of color. The scent of her mother's herbal tea and the sight of the ever-present stack of medical bills on the counter yanked her back to her oppressive reality. A wave of guilt and terror washed over her, so potent it made her feel sick. What had she done? She had allowed herself to be drawn into the orbit of a dangerously unstable man, risking the only stable income she had. The kiss, which had felt like a moment of profound truth, now seemed like an act of reckless insanity. She had traded the grim safety of her old life for a moment of connection, and in doing so she may have jeopardized everything she had worked so tirelessly to protect. The fear that she had made a catastrophic mistake, that she had gambled her mother's well-being on a broken man's whim, was a cold, heavy weight in her stomach. Alone in the vault, Julian slammed his fist against the solid oak frame of a Rembrandt, the impact doing nothing to quell the storm inside him. The scent of Ilara, something clean like rain and old paper, lingered in the air, a ghost he couldn't exorcise. The kiss had been a catastrophic miscalculation. He had intended to test her, to understand her, but instead she had disarmed him. In her eyes, he had seen, not pity, but a profound understanding that terrified him more than any judgment. He saw his mother's passion, her vulnerability, her capacity for a love so deep it could destroy a man. He felt a dark, possessive urge to keep her, to lock her away in this vault with the rest of his beautiful, broken things. This desire was a poison he recognized from his father's bloodline, and it convinced him of one terrible truth. To love Ilara would be to destroy her. He would become the very monster he despised. His retreat was a calculated act of self-preservation, but he told himself it was an act of mercy for her. He could not allow her to get any closer. He returned to his desk, the cold glass surface a comfort against his burning skin, and summoned the icy discipline that had built his empire. He would honor his offer. He would give her the money to save her family, but he would sever the personal connection with surgical precision. He would build a new wall between them, one made not of silence but of corporate structure and professional distance. He would turn her into an employee, a function, a name on a payroll. By burying the woman who had touched his soul under layers of bureaucracy, he could protect her from the darkness within him. It was a cruel, necessary amputation, and the pain of it was a penance he felt he deserved. The weekend was an exercise in silent agony for Ilara. She waited by the phone, a foolish, desperate hope warring with the cold reality of his dismissal. The call never came. Instead, on Monday morning, a sterile, formal email arrived from Thorne Industries' Human Resources Department. It outlined her new title, art consultant, and a salary that made her gasp. It was enough to erase all their debts, to afford the best care for her mother, to finally breathe. It was everything she had ever wanted, but it felt like blood money. The email was a cold, impersonal confirmation that the intimacy they had shared was being monetized. He was paying her for her silence, for the peace of her soul she had offered him in the vault. The salvation she held in her hands felt more like a damnation, a golden chain binding her to the man who had seen her completely, only to decide she was not worth keeping. When Alara told her mother the news, Martha's frail face lit up with a joy so pure it was painful to watch. Tears welled in her eyes as she clutched Alara's hand. "Oh, my darling girl," she whispered, her voice thick with relief. "I knew your hard work would be rewarded. This is it. This is security. A good, respectable man has given you a safe future." The word, safe, landed like a shard of glass in Alara's heart. There was nothing safe about Julian Thorne. He was a storm, a ruin, a beautiful, devastating tragedy. She had not found safety. She had stepped into the heart of the most profound danger she had ever known. A new, unbridgeable chasm opened between her and her mother. How could she ever explain that this financial freedom had been purchased at the cost of a different, more essential part of herself, a part she was just beginning to discover? In the quiet solitude of her room, surrounded by her beloved books, a new feeling began to displace the shame and fear. It was a slow-burning anger, a spark of defiance she hadn't felt in years. He thought he could push her away, reduce her to a line item on a budget after she had looked into his soul. He was wrong. She replayed the moment she had walked into his office, the power she had felt in her own skin, the way his composure had fractured when he saw her. He had pushed her away not because she was weak, but because he was terrified of her strength, of the way she made him feel. She had survived his cold indifference and his raw, desperate passion. She was not a fragile piece of art to be locked away. She was the one who understood the art, who knew its value and its resilience. The realization settled deep within her. She was not his victim. On her first day, she walked through the gleaming lobby of Thorne Industries with her head held high. She wore the same blue dress, a deliberate act of war. Her new office was on a lower floor, a clear message of her place in the hierarchy, but she didn't care. Her first assignment, delivered via a memo from his assistant, was to begin a complete catalog of the private collection in the sub-level vault. She understood his strategy immediately. He was forcing her back to the scene of their intimacy, trying to desensitize the memory, to turn that sacred, sorrowful space into a mere workplace. As she stepped into the private elevator alone, the doors sealing her in, she felt a tremor of fear, but it was overshadowed by a cold, hard resolve. He had started this game, but she would be the one to finish it. For 3 months, the vault was her world. Alara moved through the silent gallery with a quiet, reverent purpose that had replaced her fear. She was no longer a trespasser. She was a curator, a historian giving voice to the silenced canvases. Each day, she would meticulously document, research, and analyze the collection, her notes becoming a testament not only to the art, but to the woman who had assembled it. She learned of Julian's mother through her brushstrokes, her choice of subject, her fierce and fragile passion. In healing the narrative of this forgotten woman, Alara was inadvertently healing herself. The space was no longer a tomb of sorrow, but a living archive of a brilliant soul, and Alara had found her own strength within its walls. She had decided this would be her last week. The catalog was nearly complete, and her own future, for the first time, felt like a blank canvas she was ready to paint herself. The low, grinding sound of the vault door opening made her look up from her work, her heart giving a single, hard thud against her ribs. Julian stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the harsh light of the corridor. He was thinner, the sharp angles of his face more pronounced, his eyes holding a deep, resonant exhaustion she recognized from her own reflection months ago. He didn't speak as he entered, the heavy door sighing shut behind him, sealing them once again in the hushed, sacred space. The air crackled, not with the old tension of power and fear, but with the fragile, electric current of two exposed souls meeting after a storm. She did not look away. She did not shrink back into the shadows. She simply watched him, her gaze steady and clear, waiting for him to cross the space he himself had created between them. He stopped before a small easel she had not seen before, which held a modest, half-restored painting. It was a simple composition, a porcelain vase holding a single, drooping tulip, its petals the color of dried blood. "Verdaccio," he said, his voice rough from disuse, gesturing to the greenish underpainting his careful cleaning had revealed. She used it to give the skin tones more depth, but she also used it here, for the flower, to make the dying crimson seem more alive. He wasn't just talking about technique. He was confessing. He was showing her that he had finally stopped running from his mother's legacy and had instead picked up the tools of her trade, not to bury her memory, but to understand it, to carefully and painstakingly bring it back to life. He was learning to restore his own heart. A profound, aching tenderness bloomed in Alara's chest. She saw the truth of his solitary penance, the long nights he must have spent in this room, communing with the ghosts he had once feared. She walked to stand beside him, her shoulder almost brushing his, and looked at the damaged tulip. "The craquelure is stable," she said softly, her voice the calm, professional tone of a fellow historian. "You won't need to reline the canvas. The foundation is still strong." Her words were a balm, an absolution. She was telling him that the damage was not irreparable, that the core of what his mother had left him, his capacity for love, for passion, for beauty, was not fundamentally broken. It could be healed. It could be saved. It was a shared diagnosis of his soul, delivered in the only language they both truly understood. He finally turned to face her, his stormy eyes clear for the first time, stripped of their anger and their icy defenses. He looked not at a ghost of his past or a puzzle to be solved, but at her, Alara, the woman who had walked through the ruins of his heart and had not fled, but had instead begun to carefully put the pieces back in order. "I pushed you away because seeing you felt like looking into the sun," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "And I had spent my entire life believing I was a creature of the dark." He took a breath, the sound fragile in the stillness. "I don't want to live in the dark anymore." He didn't offer apologies or promises, only the raw, terrifying truth. He slowly extended his hand, not to take, but to offer, his palm open and vulnerable between them. Alara looked from his eyes to his outstretched hand. It was the same hand that had once brushed against hers and sent a jolt of terror through her, the same hand that had dismissed her with a cold, corporate memo. Now, it was simply a hand, offering a beginning. She thought of the invisible girl she had been, polishing floors in a world that refused to see her. She was not that girl anymore. He had not saved her. He had simply provided the catalyst for her to save herself. A slow, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time in his presence. Her choice was clear. Made not from a place of need, but from a place of profound, unshakable strength. If you believe that a person can be a home for another, and want to see where their story truly begins, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, share this story with someone who needs it, and comment with your own story of being truly seen.